Thank you for the invite to speak. I'm going to apologise before I start. I'm going to have to do this in English. That's one part of the apology. The other part of the apology is I suspect what I've got is a slightly, if you like, sort of Western take on neoliberalism, a focus on how neoliberalism developed as two things. One as a sort of, and what you get here is kind of a history of an idea. And two, its application in practice, which I think is, to a large extent, is a story that starts in the West and finishes here with, this is a shot from the fall of the Berlin Wall back in 1989, presented at the time as a key moment, not just a key moment, potentially, of course, the key moment in all of history. And not just history, but the end of history, in Francis Fukuyama, who at the time was a senior analyst in the US State Department, produced in very short order a very influential speech and later book, which argued that what we'd seen with the collapse of so-called actually existing socialism in the East was not just a kind of historical moment, but the triumph and the end of history itself, because it was the triumph of liberal capitalism. That there's an embedded argument inside of neoliberalism as it is now lived, that this isn't just a kind of body of ideas, that this is pretty much how the world is now. That there isn't any point in arguing for any alternative or anything different. What you're dealing with here is something that is reality itself. That the world is neoliberal, and therefore, for some people, particularly those who actually support neoliberalism, there is no point talking about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism does not exist. This is not something that can reasonably be discussed. That certainly for commentators, some of them, who are neoliberals in Britain, that they think of this as just a word that the left likes to use to describe things that are bad, that to describe things that it doesn't agree with, and really to present a kind of conspiratorial view of the world. In reality, reality itself is neoliberal, is the argument you get from neoliberals, and it's connected to this idea, this belief that history, in the sense of a clash between opposing ideas, has come to a halt. And of course you can see, in the other direction, in 1989, the same year, protests in Tiananmen Square, the Statue of Democracy in the background here, in the middle of summer that year, later of course notoriously crushed by the Communist Party, by the Chinese authorities. Protests there against what is in practice a form of emergent neoliberalism in China, but taking place in somewhat different circumstances. 1989 as a pivotal year is the point here. That you get the rise globally of a particular set of values, of institutions, of beliefs, and I think fundamentally, if you want to summarise what we're talking about, a set of rules of the game. The game is being played, and you can play a game in lots of different ways. The rules tell you how to play the game. What you get with neoliberalism is a game that's capitalist, a game that is capitalism, but a change in the rules about how that game is played. And it's this change in the rules, I think, that gives neoliberalism its power and its authority, and the way in which those rules become embedded, not just as, you know, if you're playing a game of football or something, you don't want to have to run off and consult the rule book every time you kick the ball. You know what the rules are. The point with neoliberalism is you all know what the rules are. You don't need to check the rule book. And everybody playing the game understands entirely where the rules are coming from. But the important thing here is that rules have to be written, and rules have a history. They don't fall out of the sky. They're not just reality itself. That there is a process under which those rules are formed, and that's what I wanted to get into, if the projector works. That's a shame. Well, what you've got here, this may prove to be slightly awkward as we go forward. What you've got here is the low dishonest decade, W.H. Auden's description of the 1930s. Extremely pessimistic man was Auden. He was convinced that nothing would ever be good ever again. And what you get in the 30s is an almighty crisis of capitalism, a crisis so deep that it's not just, you know, you have recessions, you get booms, you get slumps, things go up, things go down. This was a crisis so deep that the entire foundation of what it meant to operate capitalism is essentially under threat at this point. That the earlier version, kind of 19th century version of capitalism, the thing that Britain in particular exported to the rest of the world, with Britain and the British Empire at the centre, throughout the latter part of the 19th century, a liberal vision of the world with a small state, with limited democracy, with a concentration of wealth, a very great concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people, free markets, free trade. That entire vision of how the world would operate had by the 1930s essentially ceased to work in any useful sense. And so what you get instead is this crisis, and here we see, similar to other places, across, in particular, Western Europe and spreading into North America, a crisis so deep, a crisis of unemployment, a crisis from which there appears to be no natural mechanism of resolution. The classic liberal capitalism has a resolution mechanism built in. You have a recession, the recession paves the way for the recovery. You hit, coming out of the 1920s, into the Great Depression of the 1930s, a collapse of this automatic mechanism and a questioning of capitalism itself, and challenge appearing to capitalism, to the liberal order of capitalism, from lots of different directions. Across Europe, alternately either communism or fascism. Here you see unemployed ship workers mostly marching from Jarrow in the northeast of England down to London as a protest against unemployment. There's devastating effects of the Great Depression in particularly the northeast of the country here. Similarly devastating, although less politically traumatic, effects that you see taking place across Europe at the time. And to cope with this, you get two versions of a response to this crisis of the 30s. The first version of a response from those who are concerned to attempt to preserve elements of liberal capitalism from the challenge of economic slump and catastrophe, from the challenges presented by what amount to alternative ideologies, an attempt to try and forge a way of making capitalism continue to function so it retained its kind of liberal features. Some degree of free market, some degree of democracy. All these are the important elements here. One version of that response is to think about how the state, which had grown and developed more and more functions under capitalism, as capitalism itself had grown, how the state could be used to preserve and maintain the fundamentals of capitalism, to keep what you have in capitalism, and to make the system function less without the automatic correction of the free market and more with a form of government intervention. A version here associated particularly with the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who writes in his magnum opus, his masterwork, The General Theory of Unemployment, Employment, Interest and Money, that it's necessary for a state to intervene against the market, to ditch the idea that a free market is self-correcting, in order for capitalism itself to continue. And the general theory, the foundations of what becomes Keynesianism, his line of thinking afterwards, basically argues that it is absolutely essential for a state in a modern society to be prepared to intervene against the market. This is his fundamental argument. That's one part of it. The other version of this is to recognise that although capitalism has changed, although the market by itself doesn't seem to be functioning quite as it should, it is still possible to try and create an order of society which recognises capitalism has changed, that recognises that it faces profound challenges in the 1930s, that it faces the challenge of a breakdown in automatic correction mechanisms, that it faces the challenge of the rise of the labour movement, the appearance of democracy, mass parties in that democracy, but it is still possible to try and shape society so as to preserve again the core belief and the core functioning of capitalism as a system structured around markets in which there will be substantial inequalities of wealth and some, perhaps not very great, role for democracy. And critical thinking here, I suppose, is Friedrich von Hayek, shown here in a sort of enthusiastic mode, who develops his ideas as a response to the crisis of the 1930s and as a way of attempting to demonstrate that it is not the case that capitalism itself has to collapse or be replaced by some alternative system. Rather, you can have a version of capitalism in which the essential elements of capitalism, the free market in particular, the necessary role of inequality is preserved, and that this can be adapted and used in the new kind of societies that were emerging over this period of time. Hayek famously tries to win support for his ideas. His co-thinkers, writing from the 1930s, the word neoliberalism is first used in the mid-1930s at a seminar in France, writing in the 1930s, writing in the 1940s. Hayek attempts to present a popular argument in his most famous book, The Road to Serfdom, which is a popularization of his theories, and an argument that against a Keynesian, against a state-led version of preserving capitalism, that any attempt to preserve capitalism through the state leads automatically to totalitarianism. It is not possible for a state in a liberal society to intervene because the state doesn't know how to intervene. If it does intervene, if it tries to work against the market, it will mess up. To correct for its mistakes, it must become much more oppressive. This is his argument in The Road to Serfdom, a key early neoliberal text. So he presents this argument, he tries to write it for a popular audience. It's adapted and used, and the Conservative Party, who are the dominant governing party in Britain throughout the 30s into the Second World War, Winston Churchill, the Conservative Prime Minister during wartime, fights the 1945 general election straight after the end of the war on the basis of Hayek's theories to a very significant extent. Winston Churchill attempts to say that proposals by the opposing Labour Party to set up a national health service, to expand the range of government intervention, to introduce a welfare state, would lead simply to the Gestapo. That they produce, and they use their limited paper allocation to produce many thousands of copies of Hayek's Road to Serfdom. The outcome is a total defeat for the government at the time. And the outcome across Europe is a total defeat for versions of this early neoliberalism at the time. The swing, absolutely everywhere, is in favour of a variant of Keynesianism. That the reaction to the 1930s and the war and everything that this entails, right the way across Europe, certainly in Western Europe and going into North America, is to try and introduce more elements of state control and to embed this version of Keynesianism at a very high level with a large degree of popular support. The picture here is of a miner outside a colliery in Wales after the government had nationalised and brought into state ownership the mines, along with shipbuilding, roads, railways, the Bank of England, great chunks of the British economy nationalised and brought into state ownership at the time. This is a movement that takes place throughout, effectively, Western capitalism. So the neoliberals are presented with a problem. There is no public support for their ideas. There is very limited elite support for their ideas. They're forced, effectively, into a version of retreat. They, quite literally, as it happens, have to return to the mountains. This is Hayek and some of his co-thinkers in Montpellier in the early 1950s, shortly after the foundation of the Montpellier Society, with Hayek in the lead, as a deliberate attempt to rally the few remaining neoliberal troops, the few true believers in the free market, an attempt to meet up in this little Swiss village up in the mountains and develop their ideas. And instead of attempting to win over popular support for them, develop it as an elite set of beliefs, as a set of small adjustments, of changes that could be made, of policy proposals that could be used to win over a few key people and then gradually develop and reform your ideas over time. The conception here, at the heart of Montpellier Society, is that from the 40s, the late 1940s onwards, neoliberalism is a long-term project. It is not something that you will win immediately. It is a slow process of winning, in particular, elite support for the sets of beliefs they have. This is a quote from a British Prime Minister. It summarises the belief that had come to exist, certainly by the late 1950s, early 1960s, that if you're in Western capitalism, you had never had it so good. That the economies everywhere, and this applies certainly in the global north, everywhere were booming, that real wages were increasing rapidly, that the welfare states that existed were popular and successful, that there was a high degree of consensus about how society should be run, and that this was a form of capitalism that appeared to be, to all intents and purposes, overcome its earlier crises and wars and the issues and the seemingly irresolvable dilemmas of the 1930s on the back of an expansion of consumer spending, the welfare state and the rest of it. Here we have a supermarket from, again, the early 1960s. You had never had it so good. Things appeared to be, for Keynesianism, for this version of a response to the 1930s, working extremely well. This marginalises, by the way, the neoliberals almost entirely. The sets of beliefs that now pass the neoliberalism, that free markets are always right, that private corporations should be allowed as much liberty as possible to do what they want, that government intervention and public intervention of any kind is bad, and that private property is always supreme, that these sets of beliefs were entirely marginalised by the early 1960s. The response to this from the neoliberals is to try and invent forms of institutions that will develop their ideas in a hostile environment. A critical part of this, of course, is the rise of think tanks, of research institutions and policy institutions that are distinct from academia, that are privately funded to a very large extent, but are attempting to shape public policy. Disappearing to one side is Anthony Seldon, who is a key figure in this, who reads Hayek's Road to Serfdom. He's a person who introduces battery farming to the UK. He's a chicken farmer, and he introduces the first battery farms in Britain, makes himself extremely wealthy. He's convinced by Hayek's argument, writes to Hayek saying he wants to be an MP to try and convince people of his ideas. Friedrich von Hayek says, don't do this, set up instead foundations that will convince not the great mass of people, but people at the top of society. Set up a think tank. So he establishes, in the 1950s, the Institute of Economic Affairs, a precursor to similarly free market think tanks right the way across the world, an attempt to develop a deliberate effort to understand and refine and produce sets of ideas about how the world operates. Corporate power being a critical part of this. One of the key strengths all of this has is that if you have a set of ideas that says free markets are always right, private property is good, corporations should be allowed to do what they want within reason, this is something that is always going to be popular with corporations and with the wealthy and the powerful. You are providing them with an automatic justification for their continued existence. So the functioning of corporate power here, the growth of large corporations, is itself something that can feed into, and in terms of the financing of free market think tanks, feeds directly into, through the supply of money to these think tanks, feeds directly into the rise and growth and development of neoliberal ideas as an elite project. So, what happens here is that over the course of the 50s, 60s and 70s, this great boom begins to wear out. It begins to wear out not least because you find that as the boom develops, you find institutions like trade unions in particular, like the more radical ends of socialist parties and social democratic parties in the West, become more assertive about making claims against capital, making claims against those who own property, making claims against those who are producing wealth. And that this, over time, starts to provoke a crisis of legitimacy and a crisis of growth and of profitability in those societies. And that as the boom continues, it starts to lay the seeds, effectively, of its own collapse. Can we switch? Yeah. Yeah? All right, yeah. Close it. Right. So, key moment in this, in terms of the crisis of the post-war boom and the post-war consensus, what happens in France in 1968. That you have, on the back of what is initially a series of demands by students for greater personal freedom, develops into, at the time, the biggest general strike in history, millions of French workers on strike for a series of all-encompassing demands that stretch to questioning of the functioning and the foundations of the systems itself. This is resolved eventually in a deal between Charles de Gaulle, President Charles de Gaulle and his administration and the major trade unions for a massive increase, effectively, in people's wages. This stabilises the situation in France at the cost of squeezing still further the capacity of French capitalism to make profits. You have, as part of this ongoing developing crisis, the inability of the US as the linchpin of the global system, or at least the Western system, the linchpin through the dollar,
the state that is meant to stabilise and provide for the rest of at least the Western world economy, its inability to simultaneously perform that function, fight a war in Vietnam, fight the Cold War, and provide for increased demands for social spending at home. Effectively, the US needs to borrow on a grand scale. To enable this to happen, Nixon, in 1971, unilaterally decides to end the Bretton Woods agreements that had otherwise stabilised the international economy. And he decides to do this basically so that America can continue to borrow from the rest of the world and has the capacity to do that. Swinging back to Britain, this same process of the boom providing the conditions under which challenges to the ability of capital, to the ability of the wealthy to run society, the challenge to the market itself started to emerge. The key point in this is in 1972, where striking miners, here seen with engineering workers in support, blockading a major depot of coal, bring the country to a standstill through their capacity simply to prevent the lights being turned on as and when people realise. The government at the time had attempted to enforce a kind of an early version of neoliberalism. It had limited public support in doing so, and it was the capacity of labour at that time to be able to break it that forced that onto the back foot. The point here is, of course, that this is significantly contested. If we swing to the global south, the first true appearance, I'd say, of a neoliberal government is what happens after the coup in Chile against Salvador Allende's elected socialist government in 1973, where effectively a US-backed dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet is installed. And this dictatorship deliberately and quite explicitly looks for neoliberal thinkers to provide its plan on how to run an alternative version of the Chilean economy. This is a political act by that government, not something that happens naturally, not something that just appears because that's how the world is. It is a deliberate political act that involves the destruction of those forces opposed to capitalism, or even just asking for a slightly ameliorated version of that capitalism. And I think the decisive moment, certainly for Britain, but I think the consequences are bigger than this, is what happens in 1975, here illustrated with Derek Jarman's film of that year, Jubilee, 1975, which portrays Britain on the verge, in fact just after the total breakdown of law and order and civil society and everything in chaos, and the appearance in 1975 of Margaret Thatcher, unexpectedly, as leader of the Conservative Party, on a platform which is unabashedly and unashamedly a version of neoliberalism. That is a reassertion of the rights of private property against trade unions, against those challenges to the established order. And it is an attempt to popularise neoliberalism in a way that hadn't really happened before. It is a key moment in the movement from this as an elite set of theories and ideas to something that has the potential and the capacity for popular support. And that, roughly, is Margaret Thatcher's programme. In her very first shadow cabinet meeting, she thumps a copy of Hayek's huge book, actually, The Constitution of Liberty, onto the table and says, "This, gentlemen, is what we believe." This is a deeply convinced, ideologically convinced movement, but also an attempt to try and win some popular support. And by 1979, this version of neoliberalism is precisely able to do that. Margaret Thatcher wins the 1979 election on the promise of precisely, as she said, rolling back the frontiers of the state. A vision of society in which you have the traditional values reasserted, which include a traditional value of respect for private property and respect for the free market itself. This is Thatcher, after her election victory in 1979, addressing the Conservative Party conference that year. Now, Thatcher had the advantage, you don't really get politicians like this now, or at least we don't, of being extremely blunt when she would be addressing what she believed. Like, she had a degree of honesty that seems to have disappeared over time, probably as a function of neoliberalism itself. Thatcher would quite happily announce what her intentions were and what she believed about the world. And of course, a key statement about what she believed about the world was made in an interview, I think it was to a women's magazine in Britain in the early 1980s, that there is no such thing as society. An absolutely central neoliberal claim. That there is no such thing as society, there are only people and their families. In other words, this idea that there is something bigger than ourselves that can be defended, that you might even ask a government to defend, or that we can work collaboratively and collectively, that does not exist. Society is an invention of the left, and it is a conspiracy against people and their families. This is an absolutely central neoliberal belief. It comes, of course, attached to that, a belief or an insistence that if you try and disagree with all these things, you're fighting with ghosts, you're creating things that don't exist. If you do have a belief that how we work together matters and how we collaborate is something positive, you're in fact fighting against something fundamental. You're constructing a figment of your imagination. Reality itself does not allow beliefs that disagree with neoliberalism to exist. It's a key feature of neoliberal thought. Thatcher herself has to fight a series of battles against people who don't buy into this reality. It's the miners again, the miners' strike of 84-85. Decisively won by the government that time round, having decisively lost the previous time. This is one of the pickets outside. One of the pickets up in North Yorkshire in the last part of 1984. The miners lose, and lose decisively, and it is a key moment in breaking up the opposition to neoliberal thought. Again, the point here is that these ideas are not natural. That there was opposition, the opposition had to be broken, and it had to be broken in several stages. It had to be broken on the level of what people think, but it had to be broken on the level of how people can organise there. The other one was even more extraordinary thing to find Thatcher saying again in an interview in the early 1980s, shortly after she became Prime Minister, that economics is only the method, the object is to change people's souls. In other words, what she's saying is that for all this talk about how we will promote efficiency, we'll have dynamism, we'll have growth, we'll have entrepreneurship, we'll have all of these exciting, lovely things that neoliberalism tends to promise, the real thing that's going on here is to dig in deep inside how people think and operate and convince them that this is the only alternative, this is the only way things can be. That you no longer have a concern for wider social values, that instead you look entirely to what you yourself want, and you don't need to think too much about any kind of wider set of values or beliefs about how the world might operate. There is no such thing as society, and we're going to change your soul until you kind of are convinced by this. Which I think is an extraordinary thing to say for any politician, to have this level of kind of clarity about what they're doing. Usually you fudge these things. But nonetheless, you can see as part of the neoliberal project, not deliberately, but as part of how the thing functions, that this is a natural way of operating, that this is just how the world is, that if you believe something different, you're kind of being a bit peculiar, and that you are going to have to work as a different kind of person if you want to fit into this neoliberalised version of capitalism, where free markets are dominant, where there's a large space and scope for private property to operate. Here is somebody whose soul has been changed, working in Wall Street, just before the crash of 1987. A demonstration, of course, that this new neoliberal version of capitalism is by no means stable or secure, or any of the various promises made of it, that the number of financial crises worldwide since the 1970s is markedly higher than the number of financial crises occurring in 30, 40 years previous to that point. You don't get a stable version of capitalism out of this, you get one that is increasingly unstable. But if you think that's the only thing that can possibly exist, if you think that this is just how the world is, there's not very much necessarily you can do about this. And of course, this is the final claim, repeated insistently by Thatcher's government in one form or another, by neoliberal governments around the world. When you have a kind of softer version of neoliberalism in the various social democratic parties that bought into neoliberalism by the late 1980s, early 1990s, that nothing else can really exist. There is no alternative. There is absolutely zero chance of anything ever changing. And it's not just there is no alternative, it is not rational or possible to think of an alternative because reality itself is structured around neoliberal principles. So that, roughly, is I think how we got to neoliberalism today, as a constructed set of ideas, as something that can win sometimes a kind of popular appeal, that makes fairly bold claims about the world, that over the period of 30, 40 years since its triumph, starting with, particularly in the global north, Reagan and Thatcher, that starting with that process of being aggressive and combating and attempting to take on challenges to its authority, is now fairly deeply embedded in how we think about society. The The critical part in this, I think, is what happens around 2008, where the most neoliberalised, the most deregulated, privatised, supposedly most efficient part of the entire system, the financial system itself, collapses in disarray and has to be rescued at enormous expense, particularly, again, for Britain and the US, where the crisis starts. Enormous expense by a state that the neoliberals, until that point, have been denying had any role in anything much. And I think what 2008 opens up is the possibility of seeing that the world, although it is offered to us and promoted continually as completely inadmissible for having any alternative whatsoever, it creates the space in which an alternative can begin to exist, because it creates the reality of the reality we live in not functioning as it should. And what we've seen since then is a gradual, I think, acceleration of belief that this can occur across large numbers of people, certainly in Britain, certainly across much of the global north, that an alternative can exist, that an alternative can be created, and the possibility is now there, because their system does not function in a critical way, the possibility is now there to create something different. And on that I'll finish. Thank you.